The moment Lavinia Rhodes stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, her dress torn at the hem and her carpetbag lost somewhere between Wichita and the last relay station, she made a decision that would change the entire course of her life. She was not going to cry, not even once, no matter how bad things got. And things, it turned out, were already considerably bad. Caldwell sat at the edge of everything civilized, a cattle town perched on the Kansas Indian Territory border like a man leaning too far over a cliff. The main street was a churned river of mud from the previous night's rain, and the smell of cattle and manure hit her like a wall the moment her boots touched the ground. Saloons lined one side of the street, their painted signs peeling in the Kansas wind. A blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm somewhere nearby. Cowboys lounged against hitching posts, eyeing her with the casual curiosity of men who had not seen a well-dressed woman, even a disheveled one, in some considerable time. She was 24 years old, recently widowed, and entirely alone. The letter from her late husband's cousin had promised her a position at the Caldwell Mercantile, managing accounts and inventory. Gerald Whitmore had written with what seemed like genuine warmth and sincerity. He had said the town needed capable hands, that she would have a small room above the shop and a fair wage. He had sent the stage fare. She had read that letter 17 times on the journey west, each reading giving her a little more courage. But Gerald Whitmore was not standing at the stage depot to meet her. "Miss," a young boy with a smudged face peered up at her from the boardwalk. "You looking for someone?" "Mr. Gerald Whitmore," she said, keeping her voice steady. "He owns the Mercantile." The boy's expression shifted in a way she did not like. "Mr. Whitmore got himself shot 3 weeks back," the boy said matter-of-factly, the way children deliver terrible news. "There was a dispute over a card game. He's over at the cemetery now." Lavinia stood very still for a moment, the noise of the street washing around her. She thought of her 17 readings of the letter. She thought of the small room above the shop and the fair wage. She thought of everything she had left behind in St. Louis, which in truth amounted to very little: a rented room, a job at a seamstress shop that barely covered the rent, and the fresh grave of her husband Thomas, who had died of fever the previous November at the age of 26. She took one long breath and looked down at the boy. "Who runs the Mercantile now?" "Mrs. Fitch put a padlock on it," the boy said. "She says Whitmore owed her 6 months of rent." Lavinia picked up her remaining bag, straightened her spine, and walked down the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring mud, looking for anything that resembled an opportunity. She found it in a most unexpected place. The Silver Creek Saloon was the largest building on the south side of the street, 2 stories of weathered pine with a long covered porch. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Cook wanted. No drunks. No excuses." Lavinia stared at it for a long moment. She was not a saloon woman. She had never set foot in a saloon in her life. But she could cook. She had fed Thomas through 2 years of illness on very little money, and she had once kept a boarding house kitchen running while the actual cook was laid up with influenza. She pushed through the doors. The interior smelled of tobacco and spilled whiskey and something underneath that, sawdust and old wood, that was not entirely unpleasant. It was mid-afternoon, and the place was quiet. A bartender with impressive mutton chop whiskers was polishing glasses behind the long mahogany bar. 2 men played cards at a far table. A woman in a red dress descended the staircase with the unhurried ease of someone entirely comfortable in their own skin. "I'm here about the cook position," Lavinia said to the room in general. The woman in the red dress looked her over with sharp eyes. She was perhaps 40, handsome in a weathered way, with dark hair going silver at the temples. "I'm Me Coulter," she said. "I own this place. What's your name?" "Lavinia Rhodes." "Can you cook?" "Better than most." Me Coulter tilted her head. "You ever worked a saloon kitchen before?" "No," Lavinia said honestly. "But I worked a boarding house kitchen for 3 months, and I never once had a complaint about the food." "The men here will eat anything," Me said. "But they'll eat more of it if it's good, and they'll drink more when they eat, and that's good for my business." She studied Lavinia a moment longer. "You got a place to stay?" "Not yet. I got a room in the back, nothing fancy. You'll get it as part of the wage along with $2 a week. You start tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock, before anyone's up." It was not the small room above the mercantile. It was not the fair wage Gerald Whitmore had promised. But it was a roof and a wage and a purpose, and right now, in the muddy main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, that was enough. "I'll take it," Lavinia said. She met Vernon Ralston for the first time 3 days later. He came in on a Thursday afternoon with trail dust on his coat and a crease on his face where his hat brim had pressed during what must have been a very long ride. He was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that caught the light in a way that made him look like he was always thinking about something just past the horizon. His hands were a working man's hands, calloused and scarred at the knuckles, but he moved with a quiet kind of ease, like a man who had made peace with the width of his own body in the world. He sat down at the table nearest the kitchen door, her table, the one she'd mentally claimed because she could keep an eye on the room from it while she refreshed the bread baskets, and he took off his hat and set it beside him and ran a hand through his dark hair. "We're serving stew today," she told him, appearing from the kitchen with a towel over her shoulder. "Beef and turnip. There's cornbread, too." He looked up at her. He had a direct way of looking at a person, not rude, just honest, like he wasn't in the habit of pretending not to see things. "That sounds like exactly what I need," he said. She brought him a bowl and a wedge of cornbread and a cup of coffee, and she went back to the kitchen, and she thought nothing more of it until Me appeared in the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame with a knowing expression. "That's Vernon Ralston," Me said. "He runs cattle up from Texas every season, has a small ranch about 6 miles east of town. Good man, quiet, pays his debts and minds his business." "That's fine," Lavinia said, stirring the stew. "I was just taking his order." "Of course you were," Me said, not moving from the doorway. "Me. He's been coming through Caldwell for 3 years," Me continued pleasantly, "and I have never once seen him look at one of my girls the way he just looked at you." Lavinia did not respond to that. She stirred the stew with great concentration. He came back the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day, he lingered over his coffee long enough that the afternoon crowd had thinned to almost nothing, and Lavinia came out to clear tables and found him still there, turning his cup slowly in his hands. She began stacking dishes at the next table, and after a moment he said, "You're not from around here." "St. Louis," she said. "Long way to come." It felt necessary at the time. He nodded slowly, like that made complete sense to him. "What was in Caldwell that called you?" She told him the brief version, the letter, the job, Gerald Whitmore's untimely end, Me's sign in the window. She told it plainly, without drama, and he listened with the same honest attention he seemed to give everything. "That's a rough landing," he said when she finished. "I've had rougher," she said, and she meant it, and something in her voice told him so because he didn't try to offer her sympathy she hadn't asked for. He just nodded again. "You planning on staying?" he asked. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "I'm taking it 1 week at a time." He picked up his hat from the table and turned it in his hands. "Well," he said, "Caldwell's got some rough edges, but there are good people here too if you know where to look." "And where should I look?" she asked, more lightly than she intended. He smiled then, just briefly, just enough, and it changed his face entirely. "I expect they'll find you," he said, and he stood, and he put on his hat, and he left a coin on the table that was twice what the coffee was worth. She watched him walk out into the afternoon sun, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not grief and not fear, and not the exhausted determination she had been carrying since November. She felt curious. The weeks that followed built themselves around his visits the way a river builds its banks, gradually, naturally, without any single moment you could point to and say, "There, that is where it began." He came in most afternoons when he was in town, which was 3 or 4 days out of every 10. He was often out on his ranch, or riding the territory with his 2 ranch hands, a Mexican man named Dante, and an older former cavalry soldier named Heck, who both came in with him occasionally and ate with considerable enthusiasm, and left Lavinia generous tips. She learned things about Vernon Ralston in pieces, the way you learn a language by living inside it rather than studying it. She learned that he had grown up in East Texas, the son of a cattle rancher who had died in 1870, leaving Vernon a small inheritance and a bigger set of debts. She learned that he had spent 4 years on cattle drives before saving enough to buy the land outside Caldwell and start his own modest operation. She learned that he read books, actual books, not just newspapers, and that he kept a small collection of them on a shelf in his ranch house. She learned these things because he told them to her, and he learned things about her in return because she told them back. It was a conversation that started at his regular table and gradually moved on slow afternoons to a chair she would pull out across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup of coffee, the kitchen quiet behind her. She told him about Thomas, not all of it, but enough. About the fever, about the 2 years of slow decline, about the love that had been real even as it was being worn down by illness and fear and the grinding cost of medicine. She told him about St. Louis and the seamstress shop and the feeling she'd had standing at Thomas's grave, that her whole life had contracted to a single small point and she needed desperately to expand it again. "That's why you came west," he said. "That's why I came west," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, watching the afternoon dust drift across the saloon floor. "I had a woman," he said slowly, carefully, the way a man says something he does not say often. 5 years ago. She was going to come out and join me on the ranch. We were going to get married." He paused. "She changed her mind before she got on the train, said it was too far from everything she knew." "I'm sorry," Lavinia said. "I was for a long time," he said. "I'm not anymore." He looked at her directly as he always did. "I think maybe she was right that we weren't suited. You can love someone honestly and still not be the right fit for their life." Lavinia turned her coffee cup slowly. "That's a generous way of looking at it." "It's the honest way," he said. She thought about Thomas, about how much she had loved him and how clearly she had seen, even while loving him, that he had been a gentle, cautious man who would never quite venture past the edges of what was familiar. She thought about how she had come west alone, without a map, without certainty, and how the part of her that had been waiting to feel alive again had woken up the moment the stagecoach cleared the Missouri border and the land opened up wide and golden and entirely new. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose it is." In early June, a cattle buyer named Rutherford Ashe arrived in Caldwell from Kansas City. He was a large man, loud and prosperous-looking, with a gold watch chain and an opinion about everything. He ate 2 meals a day at the Silver Creek and tipped lavishly and called Lavinia sweetheart, in a way that made her teeth ache. He was in town to buy cattle for the fall markets, and he had his eye on Vernon Ralston's herd, a nice collection of longhorns that Vernon had brought up from Texas and fattened over the spring. The negotiations were conducted partly at the saloon bar, and Lavinia overheard enough of them, without intending to understand that Ashe was offering Vernon a price considerably below what the cattle were worth, and doing it with the confident manner of a man who expected the other party to either cave or look foolish arguing. She brought Ashe his supper that evening and managed not to say anything. She brought Vernon his coffee the following afternoon and managed to say only that she hoped his business was going well. He looked at her steadily. "You heard. Some of it. I wasn't listening on purpose." "I know you weren't." He turned his hat in his hands. "He's offering me $40 a head." She kept her expression neutral. She knew enough from the saloon conversations she'd absorbed over the past month to know that the going price was closer to 55. "What will you do?" "I'm not taking it," he said simply. "I'd rather hold the herd through another season than take a loss like that. I've got enough hay put up and the grass on the south pasture is good." "He won't like that." "No," Vernon said. "He won't." Rutherford Ashe did not, in fact, like it. He liked it so little that he spent the following evening making loud remarks at the bar about small-time ranchers who didn't know the value of a fair offer and would end up eating their own cattle by winter. The men around him laughed because Ash was buying the drinks. Lavinia was carrying a tray of glasses from a side table when she heard it, and she set the tray down on the bar and looked at Ash with the expression she had developed working for difficult customers and difficult circumstances, the one that was perfectly polite and absolutely immovable. "Mr. Ash," she said pleasantly, "I believe the kitchen has some excellent apple pie this evening. May I bring you a piece?" Ash turned to her, slightly surprised. "Sure, sweetheart." "Wonderful," she said, equally pleasantly. "And perhaps while you enjoy it, you might find something more interesting to talk about than a man who isn't here to defend himself." The bar went quiet in the specific way that bars go quiet when something interesting happens. Ash's face reddened. "Now look here, the pie," she said, "is really very good. I made it myself." She picked up her tray and walked back to the kitchen. Me, who had witnessed the entire exchange from behind the bar, was suppressing a smile with visible effort. "I believe," she said quietly to the bartender, "that Mr. Ash has just been very politely demolished." 2 days later, Vernon came in for his afternoon coffee, and there was something different in the way he looked at her. Not the honest, direct regard he always gave her, but something warmer and more careful, like a man walking toward a flame and trying to decide if it's the kind that burns you or the kind that keeps you warm. "Me told me what you said," he said. Lavinia poured his coffee. "Me talks too much." "She does," he agreed. "But in this case, I'm glad she did." She sat down across from him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the afternoon light fell through the dusty saloon windows in long golden bars and lay across the table between them. "I want to show you something," he said. "If you have a free afternoon. Sunday, maybe. The ranch." She looked at him. His expression was the straightest, most honest thing she had seen in a long time. There was no pretense in it, no game being played. He simply wanted to show her something, the way a man who is proud of a thing he has built wants to share it with someone he is beginning to trust. "Sunday," she said. "I can arrange Sunday." He smiled again, that brief, full smile that changed his face, and she felt the curious feeling sharpen into something that had a name, though she wasn't ready to say the name out loud quite yet. Sunday came with a high blue sky and a wind that moved through the prairie grass like a living thing, bending it in long waves toward the horizon. Vernon arrived at the Silver Creek at 10 in the morning with a bay horse for her, a calm, solid mare named Clara, he said, who had excellent manners and a sorrel gelding for himself. "You ride?" he asked, though he'd clearly anticipated that she might not, given the gentle nature of the mare he'd chosen. "Not well," she admitted. "I grew up in St. Louis. Clara will take care of you," he said. "She's been around nervous riders her whole life, and she's never done anything unkind yet." He was right. Clara moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm that felt almost like sitting in a rocking chair, and Lavinia found her initial tension easing within the first half-mile. The land around Caldwell opened up as they rode east, the town falling behind them, the prairie expanding into a great sweeping canvas of green and gold under the June sky. She had not realized, until this moment, how much the confinement of the saloon kitchen had been pressing on her. She breathed in the open air and felt something inside her chest uncoil. "There," Vernon said, and she looked up. The ranch was modest, she had expected as much, but it was solidly built and well kept. A long, low house of pale timber with a covered porch, a good-sized barn, a corral where 3 horses moved lazily in the late morning sun. There were kitchen gardens along the south side of the house, she noticed, with young beans coming up in careful rows. Beyond the corral, the land sloped gently down toward a creek lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves flashing silver and green in the wind. "Silver Creek," he said. "That's how the saloon got its name. It runs through town too, just further north." "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant it entirely. He showed her around with the careful pride of a man who had built something from very little and knew every board and fence post by its history. He showed her the inside of the barn, where Dante was replacing a broken stall board, and gave her a polite nod. He showed her the garden, where he was growing not just the practical vegetables, but also, she noticed, a row of sunflowers along the fence that served no purpose except to be cheerful. "The sunflowers," she said. He looked slightly self-conscious, which delighted her. "My mother grew them," he said, "old habit." She looked at the tall stalks with their promising buds, and felt something warm move through her that had nothing to do with the June heat. He made coffee on the stove, which was a good iron stove in a kitchen that was clean and plain and entirely functional. She sat at his kitchen table and looked around at the small bookshelves. There were indeed books, a dozen or so, Shakespeare and a history of the Mexican War and a dog-eared copy of something by Dickens, and at the window above the sink that looked out onto the creek and the cottonwoods. "I'm trying to imagine a life here," she said, without meaning to say it out loud. The kitchen went very quiet. She looked at him, embarrassed. "I know what you meant," he said softly. He was standing at the stove, holding 2 cups, and he looked at her with that honest, careful warmth she had come to know over these weeks. "I've been trying to imagine the same thing." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the most comfortable silence she had experienced in years, full and present and slightly trembling with the weight of what was in it. "Vernon," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "Not yet," she nodded. He brought the coffee to the table and sat across from her, and they drank it looking out the window at the cottonwoods moving in the wind, and it was enough. The trouble began in July, when a man named Cole Dennison rode into Caldwell. He arrived with 3 other men, all of them wearing the particular look of men who had been doing hard, questionable work for a long time, and had stopped caring about the fine distinctions between legal and otherwise. Dennison himself was perhaps 45, with a raw-boned face and pale eyes that held a kind of practiced contempt for everything around him. He claimed to be a cattleman from Colorado, looking to drive a herd through to the Kansas markets. He might have been exactly that. But the way he looked at the town, at the buildings, the people, the lay of the land, had a calculating quality that made me Coulter narrow her eyes the first evening he drank at her bar. "I don't like him," she told Lavinia afterward, matter-of-factly, the way me said most things. "He hasn't done anything," Lavinia said. "Not yet," me said. What Dennison had done, as it gradually emerged over the following week, was to look at Vernon Ralston's land. Specifically, the land along Silver Creek, which sat on a route that would be extremely valuable if someone was planning to run large numbers of cattle through the territory on a regular basis. A water source at that location meant the difference between a herd arriving at the Kansas markets in good condition or arriving thin and weak and worth considerably less. Dennison made Vernon an offer for the land. Vernon declined. Dennison made the offer again with more zeros on it. Vernon declined again, more firmly. Lavinia heard about all of this from Dante, who had come into town for supplies and stopped in at the Silver Creek for lunch, and who had the habit of talking while he ate when something was on his mind. "Mr. Ralston is not a man who is easily pushed," Dante said, eating his stew with steady focus. "But Dennison is not a man who is used to not getting what he wants." "What do you think he'll do?" Lavinia asked. Dante considered this carefully. "A man like that has options," he said. "Some of them are legal, some are not." He looked up at her. "Mr. Ralston knows this. He is being careful. Is there anything to be done?" "I think," Dante said slowly, "that there are people in this town who would stand with Mr. Ralston if it came to that. The question is whether it will come to that." It came to that, though not in the way anyone anticipated. On a Friday night in mid-July, someone cut the fence on the south pasture of Vernon's ranch and led his cattle out onto the open prairie. By the time Heck discovered the breach at dawn, 68 head were scattered across 4 miles of grassland, and 2 were dead at the bottom of a gulch, apparently panicked by something in the night. Vernon rode into Caldwell that afternoon looking the way A controlled man looks when something has deeply tested his control, outwardly calm, but with a stillness about him that was more tension than peace. He sat at his table in the Silver Creek, and Lavinia brought him coffee without being asked, and she sat down across from him because there was no one else in the room, and because she could see, plainly, that he needed someone to sit across from him. "The fence was cut," he said. "Clean cut, not an animal break. Do you know who?" "I don't have proof," he said carefully. "Not proof I could take to the marshal." "What will you do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Get the cattle back, fix the fence, put Heck and Dante on watch rotation." He looked at his hands. "And wait." "I hate that," she said. He looked up. "I hate that the only option is to wait," she said. "That a man can do something like that, something deliberate and destructive, and you have to be patient and careful and wait for the law to catch up." "So do I," he said quietly. "But the alternative is to do something that makes me the same kind of man he is, and I'm not willing to do that." She looked at him, at the controlled frustration in his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes and the fundamental decency that was as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands, and she felt something shift inside her, decisively and completely, the way a compass needle swings to north. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He went very still. "I'm sorry this is happening to you," she said. He turned his hand under hers and held it carefully, like something valuable that he did not want to damage. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, barely. "Lavinia," he said, and the way he said her name like it was something he had been saying privately for a long time, and was only now saying out loud, made her eyes sting in a way she had not expected. "I know," she said softly. They stayed like that for a long moment, hands together on the worn table of the Silver Creek saloon, the afternoon light golden around them, everything unspoken between them somehow entirely said. He brought her sunflowers the following Sunday. Not cut ones. He had dug up a small clay pot and transplanted a young plant into it, and he carried it carefully balanced across his saddle and set it on the kitchen windowsill of the Silver Creek's back room, which was where Lavinia slept. "For your window," he said simply. She had been quite composed until that moment. She had handled the collapse of her plan in Caldwell and the saloon kitchen and the cut fence, and all of it with the steadiness she had built over a hard year. But the clay pot with the sunflower, because he had noticed her looking at his mother's sunflowers and remembered and done something about it, undid something in her that she had been holding very carefully together. She did not cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't. But she stood there looking at the pot for a long moment while something warm and overwhelming moved through her chest, and then she turned to him, and he was standing in the doorway of her small room, hat in his hands, watching her with that honest, steady gaze. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, and she thought she saw something in his eyes that recognized exactly how much those two words were carrying. "Lavinia," he said, and stepped toward her. She met him halfway because that was the only fair thing to do. He kissed her with the same quality he had in everything honest and careful and entirely present. His hands held her face like something he wanted very much not to rush. When they separated, she looked up at him, and the feeling that had been building for weeks had resolved itself into something so clear and solid she almost laughed from the relief of it. "I have been trying very hard," she said, "not to feel this." "I know," he said. There was laughter in his voice, warm and quiet. "So have I. We were both failing." "Magnificently," he agreed. She laughed, actually laughed, the full kind she had not managed in a long time, and he smiled the full smile, the one that changed his whole face, and she thought with a kind of wondering certainty that she wanted to see that smile every day for the rest of her life. When Lavinia told her, received the news with the satisfied expression of a woman who had been watching something develop since the beginning and was very pleased with how it was going. "I told you he was a good man," Me said. "You told me he had never looked at one of your girls the way he looked at me," Lavinia corrected. "Same thing," Me said. The trouble with Dennison, meanwhile, was not resolved. In the last week of July, someone started a fire in the hay barn on Vernon's north field. It was caught early. Heck had been on watch and smelled the smoke before it spread, and the damage was limited to one corner of the building and perhaps 2 weeks' worth of stored hay. But it was deliberate and it was escalating, and Vernon reported it to Marshal Hagen, a cautious, methodical man who took notes and made no promises. "He's building a case that will hold," Vernon told Lavinia. "Hagen is careful. He doesn't move until he's certain." "Is that reassuring or frightening?" she asked. "Both," he said. She had taken to spending Sundays at the ranch, and sometimes Saturday afternoons as well. They rode together across the land, or she helped in the garden while he worked on fencing or equipment, and they talked with the ease of two people who had discovered that conversation between them was one of the great pleasures of their lives. He asked her about her childhood, a modest but decent life in a St. Louis household, the daughter of a former school teacher and a bookkeeper, which explained both her handwriting and her facility with numbers. She asked him about East Texas and the cattle drives, and he told her stories about the Kishom Trail that were both funny and harrowing, about river crossings in flood and stampedes in lightning storms and the wild, open freedom of months on the trail. "Did you miss it?" she asked. "When you settled here?" He thought about it seriously, as he thought about everything. "For a while," he said. "The trail life has something to it that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. There's a freedom to it that the settled life can't quite match." He paused. "But freedom and loneliness are closer together than they look from a distance." And there came a point where the freedom wasn't worth what it cost. She understood this completely. She had had a version of it herself in the months after Thomas died, the terrible, guilty freedom of being entirely in charge of her own life, with no one to compromise with and no one to anchor her, and how that freedom had felt first like relief and then like a void. "What did you want?" she asked. "When you stopped wanting the trail?" He looked at her across the garden fence. "Something like this," he said simply. "Land I knew, work that built something that would last, people who were." He paused, and something moved across his face that was careful and true. "People who were worth coming home to." She was quiet for a long moment. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the distance, clear and bright in the July afternoon. "I want to stay in Caldwell," she said. "I've been telling myself I'd decide week by week, but I think I've decided." He looked at her steadily. "I like the work at the Silver Creek," she continued, "and I like me and I like the prairie. I like who I am here, in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever like anything again after Thomas." She met his eyes. "And I want to keep coming to this ranch on Sundays." He put down the fencing tool in his hand and walked to her side of the fence, and he took her hand in both of his with that careful, unhurried way he had. "I am very glad," he said, low and warm, "to hear all of that." She stood on her toes and kissed him in the garden while the meadowlark sang and the July sun lay warm across the land, and it felt like something beginning rather than something continuing, though it had been beginning for weeks already. The resolution of the Dennison matter came in the first week of August, and it came in the unexpected form of a witness. A Osage man named George Tall Bear, who worked as a scout for some of the cattle operations moving through the territory, and who knew the land around Caldwell as thoroughly as he knew anything in the world, had been camped near the creek on the night of the barn fire. He had seen two of Dennison's men ride out from the direction of the ranch at a time that was inconsistent with innocence. He reported this to Marshal Hagen not out of any particular attachment to Vernon, though he and Vernon had a cordial working relationship, but because he had a precise and settled sense of what was right and what was not, and what Dennison's men had done was not. Lavinia was at the ranch when Hagen rode out to take Vernon's statement, with George Tall Bear beside him, and the kind of assembled evidence that Hagen had apparently been building for 2 weeks. She stayed back, out of the official business, but she watched from the porch, and she saw Vernon's face when Hagen told him that Dennison was being held on charges of criminal destruction of property and conspiracy, and the two men who had set the fire had turned on him in exchange for lighter treatment. The controlled tension in Vernon's face released, gradually, like a long-held breath. After Hagen and George Tall Bear rode back toward town, Vernon came to the porch and stood beside her for a moment, looking out over his land in the afternoon light. "It's over," he said, partly to her and partly to himself. "It's over," she agreed. He let out a long breath. "I should thank George Tall Bear properly." "You should," she said, "and you will." He looked at her. "You know me well." "I'm learning," she said, and smiled at him. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch of his ranch house looking out at the creek and the cottonwoods and the long evening light on the Kansas prairie, and it was as peaceful a moment as she had ever known. He asked her to marry him in late September. He did it without ceremony, which was exactly right. They were riding back toward Caldwell from the ranch, the late afternoon stretching long shadows across the grass, the sky going amber and rose at the edges. He stopped his horse and she stopped beside him, and he turned to look at her with the most direct, honest expression she had ever seen on a human face. "I love you," he said. "I have been loving you since somewhere around the 3rd week of April, when you told me the story about coming west in very plain words without any self-pity at all, and I thought you were the most real person I had ever met." He paused, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly. "I am not a man who does things casually or quickly. I've had all summer to think about this. I am entirely certain." She looked at him on his horse in the amber September light, and she thought about the women she had known in St. Louis, who had talked about love as something that arrived in dramatic, overwhelming moments. She thought about what love actually was, the kind she'd had with Thomas, gentle and real and gradually deepening, and the kind she had been building with Vernon, which was different not because it was less real but because she was different now, older and more deliberate, and what she was building with him had the quality of a foundation rather than a temporary shelter. "I love you," she said, and the ease with which the words came told her everything about how long she had actually known it. He smiled, the full smile, the real one. "Then will you marry me?" he asked. "Come live on the ranch and grow sunflowers and teach me to make whatever it is you put in that cornbread that makes it better than any cornbread I have ever had in my life," she laughed. "The secret to the cornbread is a small amount of honey." "I thought there was honey involved," he said, still smiling. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Vernon Ralston." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and he held it for a long moment in the September afternoon, and she felt the Kansas wind move through the grass around them, and thought that she had never in her life been so entirely, specifically where she was supposed to be. They were married in November, on a clear, cold day when the cottonwoods along the creek had shed their leaves, and the sky was the particular deep blue that only comes when the air is sharp and clean. Reverend Aldrich from the small Caldwell church performed the ceremony on the porch of the ranch house, with me and her bartender and Dante and Heck and George Tall Bear and his wife watching from the yard. Lavinia wore a deep green dress she had made herself, sewn in the evenings over the past 6 weeks in the back room of the Silver Creek, taking apart the better of her 2-cent Louis dresses and reworking it with new fabric me had ordered from a catalog. It fit her exactly right. Vernon wore his good coat and a new shirt, and he had shaved and combed his hair with evident care, and she thought, looking at him standing on his porch waiting for her, that she would carry this image, this precise, specific image of him in the November light for the rest of her life. The ceremony was brief and honest and entirely theirs. When Reverend Aldrich asked if she took this man, she said, "I do," with a steadiness and conviction that she felt all the way down. After me opened 2 bottles of wine she had been saving for an occasion she had apparently considered worth saving them for, and Dante produced a fiddle from somewhere and played with considerable skill, and Heck danced with me in the way of 2 people who had spent too many years pretending not to be interested in each other, and Lavinia stood beside her husband, in front of his house and laughed and felt so deeply, thoroughly happy that it almost frightened her. Almost, but not quite. Because that quality of happiness, the deep, rooted kind that comes from something real and built carefully, does not need to be frightened of. It can simply be inhabited. In the new year of 1880, Lavinia Ralston, she had taken his name with a feeling she had not expected, of adding something rather than losing something, began to make the ranch house her own, not by replacing what was already there, but by adding to it. She brought her sunflower pot from the Silver Creek, transplanted now into a larger clay pot on the porch, where the dried stalk from the previous summer still stood as a kind of promise. She organized the bookshelves, adding 3 books of her own to his dozen, and spent 2 evenings sorting through the kitchen, until its organization made the particular logical sense that her mind required. She made curtains for the front room from fabric she had ordered, a warm cream color that softened the winter light, and hung them, and stood back and looked at how the room had changed and felt something quietly proud. Vernon watched all of this with evident pleasure and no interference, which told her everything about how well he understood her. "You have opinions about curtain fabric," he observed one evening, watching her hem. "Strong ones," she confirmed. "Good," he said. The last curtains were from 1876 and were never quite right. She had continued working at the Silver Creek 3 days a week through the early winter because she liked me and the work, and because Vernon's cattle operation brought in enough to be comfortable but not so much that there was no room for her contribution to matter. Me had hired a second cook by now, a cheerful young woman named Bess, and the arrangement worked well. In March, she told Vernon she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, over breakfast, plainly and directly, because that was how they told each other things. He sat very still for a moment, and she watched his face move through something: surprise, certainty, joy, the last of which settled and stayed. He reached across the breakfast table and took her hand in both of his, the same way he had at the garden fence the previous summer. "You're certain?" he asked. "I'm certain," she said. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, with a voice that had something in it she had never quite heard from him before, something younger and less guarded than his usual manner, "I have wanted this, for a long time, a family on this land." She turned her hand in his. "I know. Are you well? Do you feel all right?" "I feel fine, slightly more tired than usual. I've been eating crackers." He looked at her with a concern so genuine and earnest that she felt that warm, overwhelming feeling again, the same one the clay pot with the sunflower had given her. "I'll ride for Doc Simmons in town," he said. "Not today," she said. "Today I want to have breakfast with my husband." He settled back in his chair, still holding her hand, and she poured his coffee and her own, and they sat at the kitchen table in the March morning light while the wind moved outside and the fire in the iron stove kept the kitchen warm, and everything was exactly as it should be. She told me the following week. Me embraced her with a warmth that was startling, because me was not a physically demonstrative person, and she sat Lavinia down and made her tea and gave her the benefit of every piece of practical knowledge she had collected over 20 years of running a saloon in the frontier West, most of which was surprisingly applicable to pregnancy. "You'll keep working as long as you're comfortable," me said. It was not quite a question. "Until the summer," Lavinia said. "At least until the summer." Me nodded. "And after, I'll come back when I can. Vernon wouldn't ask me to stop working if it's what I want to do." Me looked at her with the expression of a woman who has correctly judged many things over many years. "No," she said. "He wouldn't." That summer, the summer of 1880, was the warmest anyone in Caldwell could remember, and Lavinia was large with child in the heat of July and August in the way that is described in medical books as entirely normal and experienced by the woman living it as a considerable physical challenge. She had stopped working at the Silver Creek in June and was at the ranch full-time, and the heat made her restless and uncomfortable. And Vernon handled this with a steadiness and patience and practical care that made her love him in a new way she had not previously anticipated. Not the romantic love of the early months, though that was still entirely present, but a deeper, more domestic love that was born from being truly known in all conditions, including the uncomfortable ones. He brought her cool water from the creek in the afternoons. He took over the heavy kitchen work without being asked. He sat with her on the porch in the evenings when it was too hot inside, fanning her with a piece of folded newspaper, and read aloud to her from the Dickens, which they had both discovered was considerably more enjoyable as a shared activity than a solitary one. "I love you," she told him one evening on the porch, not as a response to anything particular, just as a statement of a persistent fact. He looked at her sideways with the warm, slightly private smile that was different from the full one, quieter, more personal, reserved for moments between just the two of them. "I love you," he said back, equally simply. The baby was born in late August, on a night when a thunderstorm was moving across the prairie from the west, the sky flickering with lightning. Doc Simmons came out from town, and me came too, which had not been the original plan, but me had decided she was coming and no one had tried to stop her, which would have been futile anyway. It was a boy. They named him Thomas James Ralston Thomas for Lavinia's first husband, whom she had loved honestly and truly, and who deserved to be remembered, and James for Vernon's father. Vernon had suggested Thomas himself, which told Lavinia something about the size of his heart that she had suspected, but was still moved to have confirmed. Thomas James Ralston was, from his first hours, a person of considerable opinions and a fine pair of lungs. He had dark hair like his father and blue eyes that Lavinia suspected would shift toward brown as he grew. He was healthy and strong and entirely, overwhelmingly real in a way that hit her with a force she had not prepared for, lying there in the August bedroom with the storm outside, and the baby in her arms and Vernon beside her. This man who was her home in a way no building ever had been. "Hello," she said to Thomas James very quietly. The baby looked up at her with the unfocused regard of a newborn, and she looked back at him, and she thought about all the things she would teach him and all the ways this land would shape him, and all the long years ahead on this ranch in Kansas with this man she had found in the most sideways and unexpected fashion imaginable. Me, coming in to check on her, took one look at her face and nodded with satisfaction. "That's what I thought," me said. "What?" Lavinia asked. "That you were going to be exactly this," me said simply. "From the first day I saw you in my saloon looking for work." Lavinia laughed softly, careful not to disturb the baby. "You had no idea what I was going to be." "I had a very good idea," me said. "I know people." The following years built themselves with the steady accumulation that a life well lived acquires, not the dramatic events of the first year, which had been full of arrivals and departures and revelations, but the deep, layered richness of a life that is working exactly as it should. Thomas James grew into a brown-eyed, sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere on the ranch from the time he could walk, and who had his mother's precise way of thinking about things and her habit of reading everything she could get her hands on. He was, at 3 years old, a small, serious person who watched the world with large eyes and asked questions that were considerably more complex than anyone expected. In the spring of 1882, Lavinia learned she was expecting again. This second pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways. She knew what to expect. Her body was less surprised by the whole business, and harder in others, because she had a 3-year-old to care for and a ranch to manage, and it turned out that pregnancy did not pause for any of these considerations. Vernon took even more on during these months, and Lavinia watched him with Thomas James, the patient, attentive way he talked to the boy, explaining things about the ranch and the horses and the land, never condescending, always honest, and felt that particular deep love again, the domestic and permanent kind. Their second child, born in October of 1882, was a girl. They named her Clara, after the bay mare who had carried Lavinia across the Kansas prairie on her first Sunday at the ranch. The mare who had been, in some small but genuine way, part of the beginning of everything. Clara Adeline Ralston, born in the October prairie, was loud and fierce and golden-haired from the start, and everyone who saw her in her first weeks agreed that she was going to be a considerable personality. "She has opinions," Vernon said, holding her on the second day. "She is our daughter," Lavinia said. "Did you expect otherwise?" He laughed, and Thomas James, sitting on the bed beside his mother and regarding his new sister with the careful assessment of a 4-year-old, said, "She's very loud." "She is," Lavinia agreed, "and she'll probably always be loud. You'll have to be patient with her." Thomas James considered this seriously. "Okay," he said, with the gravity of someone accepting an important responsibility. Vernon looked at Lavinia over the heads of their children, and what moved between them in that look was everything. The muddy main street of Caldwell, and the Silver Creek Saloon, and the clay pot with the sunflower, and the September afternoon when he had told her he loved her, and the November porch wedding, and all the mornings and evenings and small, ordinary, beautiful days between and after. She reached up and took his hand, carefully, around the baby. He held it the way he always had, like something valuable that he did not want to damage, and had no intention of ever letting go. Life on the ranch settled into its rhythms and its seasons over the years that followed, and Lavinia found that she loved all of it. The hard winters and the brilliant springs, and the thundering summers, and the long amber autumns when the prairie turned gold and the light fell across the Kansas land like something out of a painting. She loved the ranch work and the garden and the cooking and the raising of their children, not because she had nothing else, but because she had everything she wanted, and the two were not in conflict. She had continued to be involved at the Silver Creek in a part-time capacity well into the early 1880s, long after she had technically stopped working there as a cook, because me remained one of her closest friends, and the saloon had been her first home in Caldwell, and she felt a loyalty to it that was warm and genuine. She helped me with the accounts when asked and occasionally consulted on the kitchen during busy seasons, and she was there in the spring of 1883 when me announced that she was thinking about selling the Silver Creek. "To whom?" Lavinia asked, surprised. "There's a reasonable offer from a businessman in Wichita," me said, with the expression of a woman who has thought about something from every angle and is close to a decision. "You'd leave Caldwell." "I'd go somewhere quieter," me said. "I've been running a saloon since I was 25 years old. I'm 44 now. There are things I'd like to do that don't involve settling disputes between drunk cowboys at 2 in the morning." Lavinia looked at her carefully. "Heck." Me's expression did not change, but her eyes shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Heck retired from the ranch in January," Lavinia continued. "He's living on his nephew's farm in western Kansas. He's been writing you." "You have been paying far too much attention," me said. "I'm a cook and an accountant," Lavinia said. "I notice things." She paused. "Me, go." Me looked at her for a long moment. "Go," Lavinia said again. "You've been here for everyone in this town, including me, since the beginning. You deserve to go somewhere quiet and be happy." Me sold the Silver Creek in May of 1883, and she was gone by June, headed west toward her nephew's farm and toward Heck, who had been waiting, with the patience of a former cavalry soldier, for me to make up her mind. She wrote Lavinia a letter from Colorado in August that was characteristically brief and characteristically honest. She was well, the land was different but good, and she was, in her own plain words, happier than she had been in a long time. Lavinia read the letter at the kitchen table in the ranch house with Vernon across from her drinking his morning coffee, and she felt a warmth for me that was uncomplicated and entire. "Good," she said. "Good news?" Vernon asked. "The best kind," she said. "The kind that was a long time coming." Dante had left the ranch by then too, having saved enough from his years of ranch work to buy a small piece of land in New Mexico territory where he had family, and the parting had been warm and genuine, with a fine dinner at the ranch and gifts, and a promise of correspondence that had been kept faithfully on both sides. Vernon had hired 2 new ranch hands, young men, brothers, named Pat and Cal Delgado, who were proving themselves capable and good-natured. The Ralston ranch was growing. Vernon had bought the adjacent eastern parcel in 1881, doubling the size of the operation, and had spent the following 2 years building it up with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything. The cattle herd was now a genuinely significant one, and he had begun working with several other regional ranchers to organize shipping arrangements with the Kansas Pacific Railroad, which was an endeavor that required considerable record-keeping. Lavinia took over the ranch accounts. She did it so naturally and thoroughly that within 6 months Vernon could not quite remember how the finances had been managed before, except that they had been managed less well. Her precision with numbers, the bookkeeper's daughter, and her complete lack of sentiment about figures made her invaluable, and she handled it all with the same directness she brought to everything else. "You're the best business partner I've ever had," he told her one evening, looking over the quarterly accounts she had laid out for him. "You've only ever had one business partner," she said. "That's why I said the best," he said, and caught her hand as she was reaching past him for a ledger page, and kissed her temple, and she leaned into him briefly, warmly, before straightening and getting back to the accounts. Thomas James was 7 years old in 1885, and he had developed a specific and focused passion for horses, not just riding them, which he did with natural ease and his father's quiet confidence, but the study of them, their temperament and movement and breeding. He spent hours in the barn beyond what was required of him, simply watching and learning, and Vernon recognized in his son a specific kind of intelligence that is applied rather than abstract, the kind that learns by doing and touching and observing. He began teaching Thomas James to work with the young horses himself, the gentling and the training, and the boy took to it with a seriousness that was entirely his mother's and an instinctive ease that was entirely his own. Clara, at 3, was exactly what she had announced herself to be at birth: loud, decisive, intensely curious about everything, and entirely without fear. She followed Thomas James everywhere he would allow her, and a good many places he would not, and she had discovered that if she climbed the fence rail of the corral, she could reach the nose of almost any horse over 12 hands, and she considered this an excellent arrangement. Vernon had given up trying to keep her off the fence rail and instead made sure there was always someone nearby to catch her. "She is going to be something," he said to Lavinia one evening, watching Clara from the porch. "Something formidable," Lavinia agreed. "Something wonderful," he said. She looked at him, at the easy pride and love in his face watching their small, fierce daughter, and felt that deep-rooted happiness that had no ceiling and no edge. In the autumn of 1884, George Tall Bear passed through Caldwell on his way back from a scouting job in the territory, and he stopped at the ranch, as he occasionally did, for a meal and conversation. He was quiet in the way he was always quiet, not reticent but contained, a man who chose his words with care, and over dinner he said something that stayed with Lavinia for a long time. He talked about the changes he was seeing in the territory, the pressure on the land, and the people who had lived there longest, the way the frontier was narrowing with every year, the railroad bringing settlers and fences and cattle operations into places that had once been open. He spoke without anger, which made it somehow more affecting than anger would have been. He spoke as a man who had seen clearly for a long time and had made a private peace with what he could not change while continuing to know plainly that it was wrong. Vernon listened with the attention he gave to things that mattered. "I know," he said. "I know it's not right." "It is what is happening," George Tall Bear said simply. "It is," Vernon said. "And I'll tell you honestly, I don't know what the right answer is from where I'm standing, except to deal fairly with every person I meet and not pretend the taking didn't happen." George Tall Bear looked at him steadily. "That is more than most men do." "It's not enough," Vernon said. "No," George Tall Bear agreed. "It is not." They sat with that honesty between them, not trying to resolve it into something easier, and Lavinia thought that this was one of the things she loved most about Vernon, his willingness to sit with what was true and uncomfortable rather than smoothing it into a comfortable shape. It was the same quality that had made him refuse Ash's unfair cattle offer and refuse Dennison's land offer, and it ran all the way through him like a seam of something good and solid. After George Tall Bear had gone, she took Vernon's hand in the kitchen and he looked at her. "A fair man," she said. "A good one," Vernon said. "Better than most of us." She kept her hand in his. The years between 1884 and 1887 were the years of building deep, steady, accumulative building that didn't announce itself with drama but showed up every morning in the work and the life they had made. The ranch grew. Thomas James grew. Clara grew, fiercer and more wonderful every season. The accounts that Lavinia kept showed a story of gradual, real prosperity, not extravagant, not spectacular, but solid and true, the kind that does not easily blow away in a bad year. She had begun in those years to teach in a small, informal way. The Caldwell school had a teacher, a capable young man named Mr. Farris, but there were children on the outlying farms and ranches who could not always get to town, and Lavinia began holding afternoon sessions at the ranch house twice a week for the neighboring families' children who needed them. It started as a practical response to Thomas James needing more than the limited schooling he could get in town, and expanded naturally from there. Vernon built her a proper table for it, long enough for 8 children, in the front room. She taught them reading and arithmetic and the geography of the territory they lived in, and occasionally, when she felt like it, she read them stories from the books on the shelf, Shakespeare, somewhat adapted for the age of the audience, and Dickens, who it turned out worked very well for children because the man had a genius for making characters live. "You're running a school," Vernon observed one afternoon. "I'm running a table full of children," she corrected. "In my house," he said, with a warmth that made it clear he considered this entirely good. "In our house," she said. He smiled the full smile. In the spring of 1887, Lavinia discovered she was expecting a 3rd child, which surprised her because she had thought, at 32, that the family was perhaps complete at 2. Vernon received this news with the same quality he had received the first 2, the stillness, the settling certainty, the joy. "Are you happy?" she asked him. "Very," he said. "Are you?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything important. She thought about the table of children in the front room and the accounts on the desk and the sunflowers. She had sunflowers properly planted in the garden now, a whole row of them along the south fence, from the descendants of the pot Vernon had given her in 1879. And she thought about Thomas James at the barn with the young horses, and Clara on the fence rail talking to anything with 4 legs and a nose. "Yes," she said. "Very." The 3rd child, born in November of 1887, was another boy. They named him William George Ralston William for no particular family connection, but simply because they both liked the name, and George for George Tall Bear, which was an unusual choice for a Kansas ranch family, but was made with complete seriousness, and communicated to George Tall Bear himself in a letter that produced a response so brief and dignified and deeply moved that Lavinia cried reading it, which she had not done in a considerable time. William George was an easy baby, good-natured and observant, with Lavinia's blue eyes and the quiet, watchful quality his father had. Where Thomas James had been serious and Clara fierce, William settled into the household like a warm weight, content and curious, apparently delighted by everything. "He's the happiest person I've ever met," Thomas James observed at 10, regarding his baby brother with the objective assessment of a person who was not notably given to cheerfulness himself but recognized it in others. "Let's hope he stays that way," Lavinia said. "Why wouldn't he?" Thomas James asked. "No reason," she said. "I just hope it." As the decade turned toward 1889, and the frontier continued its long, slow closing fences going up across the open range, the territory filling with settlers, the cattle drives of the Kishom Trail fading into history, as the railroad expanded its reach, Vernon and Lavinia Ralston had built something that fit the changing world without losing what was essential to it. The ranch had evolved with the times. The long drive era was ending, and Vernon had seen it coming several years before it arrived, and had adapted his operation accordingly, less focus on trail cattle, more on breeding quality stock for the regional markets, establishing relationships with the Kansas City buyers that were fair and durable. He had a reputation in the county as a man who dealt straight, which was, in any community, the most valuable thing a man's name could carry. Lavinia's informal school had become something larger than she'd planned. By 1889, she was teaching 8 children regularly, and the county had sent a representative to ask if she would consider formalizing it into an official school with a proper appointment and a small county wage. She had spent a week thinking about it and then accepted, which meant that she was, at 34, a school teacher with an official appointment and her own schoolroom, which happened to be built onto the east side of the Ralston Ranch house by Vernon over the course of one February, working with Pat and Cal and Thomas James, who was 12 and old enough to swing a hammer properly. The morning the schoolroom was finished, Vernon showed it to her. It was simple and clean, with 4 long windows that let in the prairie light and a proper blackboard he had ordered from Kansas City and benches and desks enough for 12 children. She stood in the middle of it for a long moment, turning slowly, looking at the windows and the blackboard and the good solid work of the walls. "Vernon," she said. "It's your room," he said from the doorway. "You put whatever you want in it." She turned to him, and what she felt was so large and multiple gratitude and love, and the deep, impossible satisfaction of a life that had delivered something beyond what she had thought to ask for, that she couldn't quite contain it in her face. He crossed the room and held her simply and completely the way he had learned to hold her when words weren't the right instrument. "I came to Caldwell with a carpetbag and no plan," she said into his shoulder. "You came to Caldwell with better things than that," he said. "You brought everything important." She pulled back enough to look at him. "What did I bring?" "You," he said, as if it were obvious, as if it were the simplest and most complete answer in the world. She pressed her forehead to his, and the spring light came through the 4 new windows and lay across the floorboards of her schoolroom. And outside she could hear Thomas James in the barn talking to a horse in the low, steady voice he had, and Clara somewhere on the property talking at top volume to someone or something, and William probably sitting in the kitchen watching everything with his serene, observant happiness. The plains of Kansas spread away in every direction, wide and golden and endlessly themselves, and the Silver Creek ran where it had always run, through the cottonwoods and past the ranch, heading north toward town, where it had lent its name to the saloon, where a woman with a torn dress and a lost carpetbag had walked in and asked for work on a day in the spring of 1879 that had turned out to be the beginning of everything she had not yet known to want. By 1891, Thomas James was 14 and spending every available hour with the horses, and it was clear to both his parents and anyone who watched him work that he had a gift, a real one, not just enthusiasm for understanding and training horses in a way that combined instinct and learned knowledge and a quality of patient attentiveness that was rare in a person of any age. Vernon had begun talking to him about the possibility of developing a training program on the ranch, working with the horses of neighboring operations, and Thomas James received this with a seriousness that was both touching and unmistakably right. Clara was 9 and had become, in the past year, possessed of an absolute conviction that she was going to be a doctor. This had announced itself when she had carefully and thoroughly cleaned and bandaged a cut on Cal Delgado's hand and shown considerably more interest in the medical aspects of the process than in the squeamishness that Cal seemed to feel was appropriate to the situation. Doc Simmons had retired and been replaced by a younger physician named Dr. Everly, who had agreed with some bemusement to allow Clara Ralston to follow him on his rounds once a month on the grounds that her questions were, as he put it, more interesting than most adults I see. William at 4 was exactly the golden, easy person he had appeared to be as a baby. He followed Clara when Thomas James was busy with horses, and he followed Thomas James when Clara was in the schoolroom learning something, and he seemed generally to find the world to be a pleasant and interesting place that was full of people worth paying attention to. Lavinia taught her school 5 days a week and kept the ranch accounts and grew her sunflowers and read her books in the evenings with Vernon. And she thought sometimes, in moments of profound quiet, about the woman she had been in St. Louis in 1878, grieving and tired and feeling the walls of her circumstances closing in, and she felt for that woman a specific, gentle compassion. That woman had been brave in a way she hadn't recognized at the time. She had gotten on a stagecoach headed west with nothing but a letter and a decision, and the letter had turned out to be worthless, and the decision had turned out to be everything. She had talked to Vernon about this once, late at night in the autumn, the children all asleep and the house quiet around them. "Do you think about what would have happened if you'd made different choices?" she had asked him. "If you hadn't settled in Caldwell or I'd gone somewhere else from St. Louis?" "Sometimes," he said. He was quiet for a moment, thinking honestly about it as he always did. "But I've found I trust the life we have more than I worry about the ones we didn't." She looked at him in the lamplight. His face was the same face she had first seen in the Silver Creek saloon, a little older, the lines of it settled deeper and more fully themselves, the dark eyes still holding that quality of looking slightly past the immediate horizon. He was the most constant thing she had known in her adult life, and the constancy was not the constancy of sameness but of reliability, of being genuinely present across all the days and seasons of their life together. "I trust it too," she said. He reached over and took her hand in both of his, the way he always did, and she thought about how that gesture, that simple, careful holding of her hand, had told her everything she needed to know about him the very first time he had done it, at a worn saloon table with the Kansas afternoon light falling around them. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said back immediately, because it was always immediately, because it was always completely true. Outside, the Kansas night spread wide and dark and brilliantly starred over the prairie, over the cottonwoods along the creek, over the ranch and its fences and its barn, and its long row of sunflowers sleeping in the autumn cold. The wind moved through the grass as it always had, bending it in long waves toward the horizon, the same wind that had been blowing across this land since long before any of them had names for it. The Silver Creek ran in the darkness, making its quiet sound, steady and clear, heading north toward the town where everything had started. And in the ranch house, in the lamplight, Vernon and Lavinia Ralston sat together as they had sat together for 12 years now, hands intertwined, everything that mattered inside the walls they had built, and the long good future stretching out ahead of them as wide and open and full of promise as the land they had made their home. Thomas James would grow into a man known across 3 counties for his work with horses, establishing a training operation that brought riders from as far as Colorado to the Ralston Ranch. And he would eventually marry a quiet, sharp-minded woman named Anna who had come west from Ohio with her family, and who matched him in the particular way that complementary people match, not by being alike, but by filling each other's silences with exactly the right things. Clara would become exactly what she had announced at 9, a physician, educated against considerable odds, and the particular friction that the year 1890 placed in the path of women who wanted to study medicine, trained first by correspondence, and then at a women's medical college in Philadelphia, and returned to Kansas with her degree, and the specific fire of someone who had been told it was impossible, and had done it anyway. She would set up her practice in Caldwell and keep it for 40 years, and people would ride 20 miles to see her. William would take over the ranch accounts from his mother, not because he was told to, but because he discovered, at 15, that he had a gift for numbers and a love for the land that combined naturally into the management of the place, and because Lavinia sat with him for 6 months teaching him everything she knew about the ledgers before declaring, with satisfaction, that he had exceeded the student. And Lavinia and Vernon Ralston would grow old on their land beside their creek, in the house they had built together, in the life they had made from the most sideways and uncertain beginning imaginable, a torn hem and a lost carpet bag, and a cook wanted sign in a saloon window in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879. On their 25th anniversary, in November of 1904, Vernon stood on the porch of their ranch house as the November light fell across the Kansas prairie, and Lavinia stood beside him, and they looked out at the land together in the comfortable silence of people who have said everything important many times over and have found, each time, that it bears saying again. The cottonwoods along the creek were bare in the November cold, their branches silver against the pale sky. The sunflowers in the garden had gone to their winter sleep, but next spring they would come back as they always did, gold and deliberate and facing the sun. The ranch stretched away in every direction, solid and real, built year by year from the work of their hands and the choices of their lives. 25 years, Lavinia said. 25 years, Vernon agreed. He was 55, his dark hair silver at the temples, the lines of his face the deep-settled lines of a man who had lived a good and honest life in the open air. He was still the most straightforward, honest-eyed person she had ever known. She was 50, she had turned 50 in the summer with a celebration that the children and grandchildren, Thomas James had 2 small children by now, round and brown-eyed and constantly underfoot, had organized with touching enthusiasm. She was 50 and entirely, specifically, gratefully herself. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the November wind came across the prairie with the smell of cold grass and distant snow and the wide, clean Kansas air. "I'd do all of it again," he said. It was the plainest and most complete thing he could have said. She turned and looked at him, this man who had come into her life carrying trail dust and honest eyes and a heart that had been waiting, without sentimentality, for something real to come along. And she thought of Me's sign in the Silver Creek window, and the clay pot with the sunflower, and the September afternoon on horseback when he had told her he had loved her since April, and all the mornings and evenings and small, ordinary, extraordinary days of the quarter century since. "So would I," she said. "Every single day." He pulled her closer, and she let herself be held, and the Kansas sky went on forever above them, wide and cold and brilliant with the particular light of late autumn on the plains, and the Silver Creek ran where it had always run, and the ranch stood solid and real as the love that had built it, and everything was finished and full and entirely, completely right.